viewers, welcome to this lecture entitled History of Environment in India, the Colonial Period. Colonial period was the part of the Indian subcontinent that was occupied by European colonial powers during the Age of Discovery. European power was exerted both by conquest and trade, especially in spices. The search for the wealth and prosperity of India led to the colonization by the Americans after Christopher Columbus went to America in the year 1942. Only a few years later, near the end of the 15th century, Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama became the first European to re-establish direct trade links with India by being the first to arrive by circumnavigating Africa. Having arrived in Calicut, which by then was one of the major trading ports of the Eastern world, he obtained permission to trade in the city from Samurti Raja. The next to arrive were the Dutch, which was then the main base in the city of Ceylon. Their expansion into India was halted after their defeat in the Battle of Colachel to the Kingdom of Travancore during the Travancore-Dutch War. In the later 18th century, Great Britain and France struggled for dominance partly through proxy Indian rulers but also by direct military intervention. The defeat of the formidable Indian ruler Tipu Sultan in 1799 marginalized the French influence. This was followed by rapid expansion of the British power through the greater part of the Indian subcontinent in the early 19th century. By the middle of this particular century, the British had already gained direct access of, or rather direct control over all parts of India. British India, consisting of the directly ruled British presidencies and provinces, contained the most populous and valuable parts of the British Empire and thus became known as the jewel in the British crown. India, during its colonial era, was a founding member of the League of Nations, a participating nation in the Summer Olympics in 1900, 1920, 1928, 1932 and 1936, and also founder member of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. In 1947, India gained its independence and was partitioned into the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan, the latter of which was created as a homeland for colonial India's Muslims. Now, on the basis of this, there have been certain laws that were being formulated during this particular era, which includes the Shore Nuisance, the Bombay and Colaba Act 1853. This is basically the earliest act on the statute book concerning control of water pollution in India. It was the first act in the field of environmental protection in India, which was enacted by the British for the British India. This act was passed so as to regulate the waste nutrients which were being discharged in the coastal areas of Bombay and the Colaba regions from various industries that were functioning in these areas. The next act that was being passed during this era was the Oriental Gas Company Act 1857. This law imposed restrictions on This act imposed restrictions on fouling of water by the Oriental Gas Company. This company basically fined rupees 1,000 for fouling the water and for the subsequent contamination, which was a great offense. Rupees 500 per day was also fined for this kind of contamination. Oriental Gas Company was among the first act in the field of water pollution. The Indian Penal Code Act was formulated in the year 1860. As per this act, as with regards to water pollution, Indian Penal Code says that whosoever voluntarily corrupts or contaminates the water of any public spring or reservoir so as to make it less fit for the purpose of which it is ordinarily used shall be punished with simple or rigorous imprisonment for a term exceeding to 3 months or fine of 500 rupees or both. The definition is confined to the voluntary act and acts committed without any knowledge or accidentally would not be covered under this particular present law. The next act that was being formed was the North Indian Canal and Drainage Act 1873. Under this particular act, certain offences have been listed under the act sectioned in 70. It was to regulate the way the canals for the purpose of irrigation as well as for discharge of the effluents from various industries as well as the drainage system is to be controlled. Now, coming to certain acts which were being framed with concern to the environment, certain more acts were being done in this particular colonial period, which included the Obstruction in the Fairways Act 1881. Under this act, the Section 8 of the act empowered the central government to make rules to regulate or prohibit the throwing of rubbish in any fairway leading to a port causing or likely to give rise to a bank or shoal. Then there were certain other acts like the Indian Fisheries Act 1897. As per this act, there was a penalize, or the people who did not follow this particular law were being penalized for killing fishes by poisoning water and by using other explosives. Section 5 of this act prohibits destruction of fishes by poisoning of waters. Then there was the very important Indian Forest Act 1927. As per the act, it was being made very comprehensively and contained all the major provisions of the earlier act and the amendments made thereto, including those relating to the duty on timber. The Act of 1927 also embodied land using policy whereby the British could acquire all the forest land, village forest and other common property resources. Section 26, Part 1 of the Act makes it punishable if any person who, in contravention of the rules made by the state government, poisons water or the forest area. The state government has been empowered under the Section 32F to make rules relating to poisoning of water in the forests. This act is still in force, together with several other amendments which are being made by the state government. There were certain other acts that were being made for the protection of the Indian environment. They included the Explosive Act, then the Bombay Smoke Nuisance Act, other acts that were being made specifically in the year 1912, the Inland Stream Vessel Act 1917, Mysore Destructive Insects and Pest Act 1917, Poison Act 1919, Indian Forest Act 1927, Motor Vehicles Act 1939, etc. There were certain air pollution acts like the Indian Penal Code 1860, Indian Broilers Act 1923, Motor Vehicles Act 1939, the Poison Act 1919. There were certain municipality laws which included the Uttar Pradesh Municipality Law 1916, Bihar and Orissa Municipality Law 1922. Both of these laws were amongst the earliest laws for regulating the environmental conditions in the cities by the help of the municipality laws. There were also certain wildlife protection acts like the Forest Act of Madras 1973, Elephant Preservation Act 1879, World Birds Protection Act 1887, World Birds and Animal Protection Act 1912, Haley National Park Act 1936. Now, from the information discussed so far, the first quiz is: the Indian Forest Act was made in which of these years? The options are 1927, 1934, 1923 and 1925. Yes, you're right. The answer to this particular question is 1927. Now, in the field of wildlife protection, the first wildlife statute was enacted in Madras or Chennai for the protection of wild elephants. The law introduced a general prohibition on destruction of wild elephants and imposed penalty on those who violated this particular embargo. The first effort by the central government came after 6 years later by the passing of the Elephant Preservation Act in the year 1879. In 1887, central government enacted the Wild Birds Protection Act prohibiting the possession or sale of wild birds recently killed or taken during the notified breeding season. In the year 1912, the central government enacted a broader Wildlife and Animal Protection Act. Extending to most of the British India, this law specified a closed hunting season and regulated the hunting of designated species through licenses. Indeed, all the statutes related primarily to the regulation of hunting and did not regulate trade in wildlife and wildlife products, both which were major factors in the decline of Indian wildlife. As a consequence, wildlife degradation continued and many species became extinct. Colonial Environmental Agenda, reviewing the book Nature and Orient in the Economic and the Political Weekly, David Hardiman had written that the forest agenda of the British colonial powers was subjected to the critical enquiry in the book through protagonists arguing for and against the forest policy adopted through the British. The arguments basically centered around the current crisis for the huge deforestation, while the forest policy of the British colonial era was held responsible for originating the current crisis. It was also contended that the similar policy sustained to be implemented approximately seamlessly in the post-colonial era. This actually was an extension of the location taken through the Ramachandra Guha in his writings dating from the early 80s. Guha's location was that the British had recognized an autocratic forest department which sought to use timber for imperial requires through enclosing the forests and excluding peasantry formed by them, as a result of which the resource base got affected. This gave rise to desperate protests in the late 19th century and later the nationalist-led protests of the Gandhian era. With no substantial changes after independence in the year 1947, the protests sustained, giving rise in time to the Chipko movement. Guha was highly critical of the British, who in his explanation were blamed for both snatching the forests from the people and also for providing the institutional base for their commercial use. This location was contested through the British scholar Richard Grove, who sought to illustrate that the original greens in India were environmental issues. urbanized unscrupulous through a group of extraordinary Scottish medicos serving in the colonies, which sought initially to understand the connection which was being flanked by climate and health, but extremely quickly became the experts in botany and ecology. They argued that there was a secure connection flanked by deforestation and environmental desiccation, and pressed strongly by the state-led conservation of forests. Through their pressure, the earlier attitude towards forests was replaced from the mid-19th century onwards through active management. It is apparent from the positions taken through both the protagonists as well as the opponents that the colonial environmental agenda, as reflected in the British forest policy in India, was based on the premise that the forest possessions were valuable natural assets on which the state possessed absolute proprietary rights. The logical extension of this premise was that the societies exercising traditional rights in excess of forests were not justified in their claims and should be delegitimized for such claims in order to just protect the forests. The procedure of extensive use of wood as a forest product had begun earlier in England, earlier than that of the Industrial Revolution. But this procedure hastened approximately mid-18th century when use of charcoal was practiced on an extensive level as a fuel to run the blast furnaces. Through the third quarter of the 18th century, the forest situation was beginning to seem grim as vast regions were denuded of all the forest cover. The maritime expansion and wars in the middle of the colonial powers for grabbing a big slice in global wealth as one could manage had maintained a constant pressure on the ship structure industry as well. India as a colony was a mainly opportune possession for England. One major pressure upon the English colonizers was for procuring timber for ship structure. In this situation, Indian teak was exposed as a product of excellence and durability. In 1850, on the eve of the rise of the large-scale industry in India, the most prominent community, that is the Parsis, engaged in the trade of the two principal exportable goods from the western coast, them being cotton and opium. Colonial commodities created conditions that can be better understood in global context and by scrutinizing all the interconnections between the developments in different parts of the world. As it is well known, opium was a major colonial commodity. It was linked to trade in several other commodities of the modern era, such as tea, sugar, cotton, and slaves. The movement of these commodities across continents shaped capitalism in very specific ways. In case of India, for instance, earnings from the several components of the opium enterprise played a vital role in the growth of industrial capitalism in Western India. The worth of timber India or the Indian timber may be or had been common perception of England and was saved in war with Napoleon due to the regular supply of teak timber from India. As stated through Gadgil and Guha, in the early 19th century and following its defeat of the Marathas, the East India Company razed to the ground teak plantations in Ratnagiri, nurtured and grown through the legendary Maratha admiral Kanhoji Angrel. Another factor which is responsible for the use of forests was the expansion of railways in India. A stage of laying railway roads all across India had begun specifically in the second half of the 19th century, and it was needed in extremely big numbers, whereby the wooden sleepers, was actually the foundational base for placing the railway tracks on it. The sub-Himalayan forests of Garhwal and Kumaon were totally denuded. The destruction was also the consequence of a policy of felling trees without accurately estimating the requirement of sleepers. Big number of felled trees in information was also being gathered. Therefore, it was been found that the agenda of the English colonial power was very clear, as its main objective was to produce big commercial timber. The forests were ruthlessly subjected to this particular commercial aim. The other objective was to augment the volume of revenue collection. Forests were again treated with disdain as the act of agricultural expansion cleared big regions of all obstructionist wooded growth. In this scheme, forest dwellers were to become great sufferers. Now, from the information that was being given just now, the next quiz is: in 1850, on the eve of the large-scale industry in India, which of the following was the most prominent community engaged in the trade of the two most principal exportable goods from the western coast, being the cotton and opium? The options are European capitalists, Bengali traders, Parsis, and Chettiars. Yes, you're right. The answer to this particular question is Parsis. Now, it was been found that though in the colonial era, there were several acts which were being made with profound impact, but a lot of importance was also being given to the destruction of trees, which whereby the wood which was there was actually required for the construction of sleepers, specifically used for railway or for the construction of ships, which actually caused a lot of damage to the forest cover that is present in India, and was also one of the stepping stones whereby the decline in the forest cover had started by then and is still now declining. The colonial era saw a qualitative shift in the man-forest connection added for the Indian demands, the demands of the British Raj. With the advent of the colonial rule, an element of conscience and ruthlessness again began to determine the man-forest connection. India was systematically converted into a colony serving the interest of the mother country. The British came to India as a trading nation. The gradual establishment of the political harmony, jointly with the development in the field of transport and communication, colonial trading practices and industrial revolution brought in relation to the substantial changes in this connection. Forests now came to be seen as possessions to cater to the necessities of the expanding colonial political economy. Now, it was also been found that the forest policy of the colonial administration worked within the overall framework of the priorities of the imperial policy. One of the foremost priorities was to generate more and more revenues for a self-supporting British rule. This logic suggested that forest products had to be marketed. The colonial rule made constant efforts to discover markets for the multiple species of India's tropical forests. The Himalayan forests also provided bamboo, sal, and many other species of conifer for the urban centers of Punjab and the United Provinces, and also for the military cantonments and hill stations. Separately from the teak export deal in the minor forest produce also picked up in this particular century. Resins, turpentine, tanning materials, essential oils, and other associated non-timber forest products had a diversity of industrial applications, and foreign deal in such items actually showed a steady rise. Huge importance of forests was actually being reflected in this particular century. Throughout the First World War, enormous amounts of timber and bamboo were exported to help the British military operations in Egypt as well as in Iraq. The Second World War was more devastating for the Indian forests. India became the sole supplier of timber to Middle East and later to the Allied forces in Iraq and the Persian Gulf. Also, it was being seen that from the middle of the 19th century, a large-scale slaughter of animals was started through the British. Much of this shooting was motivated through the desire for the big bags. Several Indian princes had already spent a lot of time in killing all these animals, and also the fact that shikar or exploits in the British era was one of the most important activities which they performed. So it was been found that with the phenomenal growth of population and urbanization and the consequent extension of agriculture, construction behaviors, rising industrial proliferation, mining, quarrying behaviors, construction of dams had created lot of impact on the environment. The beginning of the colonial era was actually a sort of format whereby the people could understand that more and more uses of nature were there. But on the contrary, most of the people focused upon destroying the nature and not safeguarding it. Therefore, from this particular lecture, it can be concluded that though in the colonial era the British Raj was the most important part of it, but the British Raj focused only upon their welfare and their good. They did not think about the environment, not safeguarding it. And keeping in mind this particular fact, that this construction of all the requirements like the construction of dams, the construction of all the necessary banks, then the sleepers for the trains, everything was required, and for this huge resources of nature were required. And in India, during that time, they were the sole supplier of teak, not only in this particular country, but to the other foreign countries as well. This created a lot of damage to the environmental resources which were present. And of course, after this, the post-colonial era had given a separate dimension for the particular environmental concerns. Thank you.